So should you use Azure Resource Manager templates or something like Terraform for your environment? And this is a very environment-specific question, and it's going to depend on what you're currently using. If you're already using ARM templates or Azure Resource Manager templates, then you can go ahead and continue using them. But the big difference is ARM templates are built for Azure. They deploy resources inside of Azure. Terraform uses the HashiCorp configuration language, and it can deploy across multiple clouds. It's kind of cloud agnostic. It uses a provider and resource model, whereas ARM templates only deploy Azure resources. So if you're trying to deploy across a portfolio of clouds or a portfolio of environments, even on-prem environments, Terraform would be a really good choice. Now, if you're already using ARM templates and you want to look at something like Terraform, that's totally cool and that's great. You can actually deploy ARM templates using Terraform. Terraform has a resource to deploy an ARM template. So say you've already got one and you're using it now, you can still use it and you can start transitioning into Terraform if need be.
And hey, what's up? My name is Jay Gordon. I'm your host today. Welcome to DevOps Fireside Chats, where every month we get together, we have a conversation about a different DevOps topic, and we really have a good time together. This is a conversation, and without our conversation, I should say without you, this conversation really doesn't go anywhere. So we'll put up some information about how you can get in touch, because we really would love to have you part of all of this. So we've already got some questions that we've got from people. We're going to be asking more that come in live and taking your comments. Make sure you head over to Learn TV. And actually, we've got a poll up wherever it is now. You can take a look at all the things that are currently going up on Learn TV. But right now, we've got a poll up. Go ahead, go to aka.ms/LearnTV. I will put up that link in a second. But right now, I want you to meet our panel. And so the first person I'm going to bring up is a person that I am really, really happy to have this conversation with. She's pretty amazing. It's April. Hey, April, how are you today?
Hey, Jay, doing really well. Thank you for having me here.
No problem. I'll get more into what you're up to in just a few minutes. Next up, we've got Eric Sorenson. He comes to us from Puppet, a company that has been one of the innovators in infrastructure as code for years. We'll talk about a little bit more with Eric and what he's doing, what he's been up to in just a moment. But I can't forget the last, but certainly not least. It's Steve Arowski. Hey, Steve, how are you?
Doing all right. Good to be here, Jay.
Great. So I want to get a quick intro to everybody. I've given your names. I've talked about you a little bit, but I want to hear a little bit more about you. And since, Eric, you are our out of Microsoft guest, I'd love you to kind of tell our audience, what are you up to? What do you do? And how do you do it?
Sure. Well, first, thanks for having me. It's really good to be on with y'all. I work at Puppet, as you mentioned, and I'm a product manager there. Lately, I've been working on a new software as a service thing that we're building called Relay. And Relay lets you do DevOps workflow automation through the service that we run. It's pretty cool. It's a little bit of a departure from most of my time here at Puppet, and most of my career, honestly, I've been working on kind of the core Puppet configuration management, infrastructure as code tooling. And so it's been pretty fun to shift over and work on more cloud-centric approaches and work with a new tool chain. And yeah, I'm pretty excited about it.
Very, very cool. Well, thank you for taking some of your time to join us.
Absolutely.
And the next person I'd like to ask a little bit more, April, why don't you tell us, you work with Steve and I at Microsoft. Why don't you tell us about what you do and how you do it?
Sure. So I'm a senior software engineer in the commercial software engineering organization at Microsoft. So we're basically build with, code with customers. So we're brought into customer engagements where they're blocked into getting into Azure and go, we need help. And these are usually some of the bigger customers around the globe. And we're out there coding with them and helping them get into Azure, unblock them. And we're living and breathing DevOps day in and day out. So my background comes from the ops side, moving into development. And I work a lot with so I do a lot with Terraform, ARM templates, and automation.
Very cool. And our, like I said, last but certainly not least, one of my teammates, Stephen Arowski. Hey, Steve. I will ask you the same question. What do you do and how do you do it?
I talk a lot. So I'm on the advocacy team with UJ, and I focus on DevOps scenarios. My background is operations, like Gabriel, and I moved into development. I've always done a little bit of development along the way because I was always an admin at small shops, so there's always some little tool to build. Before I came to Microsoft, I was over at Chef, so one of Eric's competitors for a little while, and it's building tools for operations. And yeah, that's I came into the infrastructure as code space with PowerShell desired state configuration. So that was my kind of my entry point into when I got bitten by the bug and found my way here.
Very cool. Well, I want to say thank you to the three of you for joining us today. We've got some questions and we will answer them. We will go through some things that you all want to talk about. And I think what we should hit first, I think, is the most important of all this. Obviously, we're talking today about infrastructure as code. Here's this little image representation of how code ends up in computers. But I'd love to get you all kind of, what is your definition of infrastructure as code? And April, I'll let you kind of kick that off.
So my definition is pretty simple. I like to think of it as pets versus the cattle model. So I don't have like a strict dictionary definition for it. Some people are like, how do you define infrastructure as code? So having been in the ops space, you used to feed and water your environment. Like you take care of your dog or your cat and really feed and water it, nurture it. You name your environment and you're really cautious about your naming scheme. And it was a personal attachment to that environment. And then we move into the cattle model with infrastructure as code. So names don't matter. We just move things out in bulk. And when something breaks, we blow it away and we rebuild it and we can deploy it with code instead of, pointing and clicking. So I always kind of use that pet versus cattle mentality when I talk about infrastructure as code and I'm trying to define it.
Sure. And so I'll ask a question over to Eric. Eric, can you give me what your kind of first foray into this world was? Did you just take it on when you went to Puppet, or were you doing something before that really utilized infrastructure as code?
Yeah, well, before I worked at Puppet, I was a Puppet community user and worked on it from that end of it. I worked at Apple and did some large-scale rollouts of new services there. Thing called iCloud that you may have heard of, and some others. But we used Puppet there as our kind of core infrastructure as code idea, because we wanted to make sure that nothing went out to production as a one-off. We wanted everything to be repeatable, and we wanted it all to be able to, be rolled out with an understanding of how we could recreate it if we needed to, how we could stamp things out in as close to the same as we could. And all of that idea came from, obviously working at things at scale. But even prior to using Puppet there, I was a CF Engine user back in the day. And I think CF Engine really was responsible for a lot of the concepts that we still, tools, even ARM tools, ARM templates, Terraform, everybody kind of has settled upon this idea of having idempotence as a key principle of your infrastructure as code, and to get as close to a declarative description of what that infrastructure ought to look like as possible. So you're minimizing the amount of scripts and conditionals and those kinds of branches that can introduce unexpected changes in the environment. We want everything to be very repeatable. And a lot of those ideas came from that CF Engine community and from the way that tool worked back in the early 2000s.
Very, very cool. And so, Steve, you've obviously also came from another infrastructure as code company in Chef. Let me ask you, what did you see the community bring to Chef while you were there?
Oh, everything. I mean, the Chef community is one of the reasons that I went to work there. So my background was as a Windows sysadmin, and configuration management was still pretty new at that time to the general Windows audience. There were a handful of folks doing stuff. And actually, we were a puppet shop when I got into configuration management. I worked at Stack Overflow, little Q&A website you might have used. And so we were a puppet shop. So Puppet managed our Linux machines, and we needed to do something on Windows. And PowerShell desired state configuration was coming out right around that time. And it was a little early for Puppet. Eventually built some awesome integration for desired state configuration, but it was before that. But while I was digging into that, I got talking with folks in the Chef community, and I actually did an episode of
The food fight?
Matt Stratton and Trevor's show.
The Arrested DevOps.
Arrested DevOps.
So we did a show on configuration management, and it was Sean O'Meara from Chef. It was myself talking about desired state configuration, and of course, I'm going to blank on names there. He went to work for Chef as well, but he was a big Puppet user. Come on, why can't I did a podcast with the guy too? I'm totally blanking on names here. But we did this show around configuration management and things, and everybody on the show eventually ended up working at Chef, including Trevor, right? But anyway, the Chef community really, almost all the projects were open source outside of some of the management server stuff. And the contributions from our community really drove a lot of what happened. Our development process and guidance for the open source project happened in the open. And the Chef community summits, where the contributor summits, were some of the most invigorating things I'd ever been a part of. So community had been a huge part of it. And today, to this day, I mean, it drives the roles I look for is community.
Open source, it kind of exists because of community, and community kind of thrives within open source. So one and the kind of are almost in the same. They are so directly linked. So I've got our first question that came from our audience. And so Tom Kirkove wants to ask, and I'm going to let the three of you kind of give this answer. We were excited to hear about Project Bicep, as we use a lot of ARM templates. What are the benefits of using Bicep versus Terraform? April, why don't you kind of kick that off?
Sure. So for anyone that uses ARM templates, I think the learning and the entry point ARM templates can be really difficult for a lot of people. So if you're in an ops background, learning JSON was really difficult. So one of the biggest, and I think biggest changes you'll see with Project Bicep and what they've done is they want to take away that barrier and that entry point. So it takes away the JSON requirement. It's a lot simpler, a lot cleaner syntax. And that's the biggest thing. And they built in some other tooling into the product to help you write ARM templates. So they built an IntelliSense into it. And I think when I interact with customers or anyone in the community, and learning ARM templates gets really frustrating, flat out. There's no way around that. And that's why I really stuck to using Terraform, because it was easy to use. Customers picked up on it. It was easy to teach and easy to run with. And it doesn't matter what your background was with your coding styles. So I think the biggest benefit of Bicep for me and seeing that community is the lack of JSON, because nobody likes JSON. I mean, some people do, but I don't. So I think for me, that's probably one of the biggest benefits of it is just they've reformatted the readability and the configurability of it.
Sure. And so one of the things that it brings is just kind of a different DSL, domain specific language, which is a really critical part of infrastructure as code. Eric, you've messed with a few of these DSLs before. Which do you find is really the most intuitive for newer users, especially ones that are trying to make the transition into infrastructure as code?
Yeah, it's always a tough thing. We had a thing going around at the last configuration management camp last year about everyone was sort of talking about the evolution of configuration DSLs and how we sort of start off hard coding values and then move on to kind of a templated approach, and then evolving into a DSL, and then ultimately a fully fledged language. And then you need another language to configure that first language. So things are, and then the cycle repeats itself, right? There's a great paper on this, or a blog post on this called the configuration complexity clock, because it really does go around like a clock. And I don't know that intuitive is really the right way to evaluate them, but it really is about what's the appropriate match for the problem that you're trying to solve. I think certainly the most approachable is something that's, a pure YAML kind of representation of it. It's an easy, just a data structure, but that you quickly run into scale problems, as I think anybody that's worked on configuring Kubernetes through typing YAML directly, like you just don't want to. It's a world of pain that you don't want to go into. And so more higher order languages get developed in order to work with that, but each one of those comes with a cost of complexity until at some point you get to the point which I think Puppet reached quite a while back. Terraform reached recently with their 0.13 release, where the users really needed to do things that were constrained by the language because the language itself wanted to be, simple and declarative and approachable. But the problem domain got complex enough that we needed loops and we need conditional statements and those kinds of things. And at that point, you're almost at the point where you need a real language. This is why an approach that Pulumi has taken is really interesting, because they use full-fledged programming languages and just apply them to the domain of infrastructure as code. So if you're used to working in Python or TypeScript or even the .NET languages, you can continue to use those same languages, but to build infrastructure with them instead of building application codes. So I think it really is about like where you are on your learning journey of it, as well as what's the complexity of the infrastructure that you're trying to build and manage.
Great answer. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, those are some really good points, and I think it really speaks to what April was saying about the perceived complexity around ARM using JSON as its templating language, because it's not just JSON, right? It's JSON with a bunch of functions added into it, so that it made it very hard to reason about what things were going to happen. So then you need your language like Bicep to manage your templating language, to manage your infrastructure. I just wanted to concur kind of with April and Eric's assessments there. And yeah.
And April, if I'm right, something new is coming out of Bicep, right?
There is. We have release 0.3 coming out. It's going to be announced officially at Ignite by Mark Rasinovich, but we can spill some beans here. There is going to be parity in features and functionality with ARM templates. So there, again, as Eric mentioned, we're adding in loops and conditionals because we need it. They've integrated with Azure CLI and Azure PowerShell, which is great. And I think also that one of the biggest things about ARM that it's great for Azure is that whatever resource you want to deploy, it's day zero when that resource comes out into Azure, you have that capability to hook into the API and deploy it with Bicep and ARM templates, which is great, which is something that, you're working with Pulumi or Terraform and you're calling the Azure API, you can't always call that resource. So that's where we then have to go, what do we have to write custom to get this deployed because it isn't available, or we have to write our own. So it starts to increase that complexity. So yeah, so there's new releases coming out, 0.3. It's going to be released soon. So yeah, it's some good stuff.
And I guarantee you, I did not know beforehand that you were releasing that feature when I went off on that tangent.
I said nothing. I just sat here quietly. But yeah, you can give Bicep a try today. You can get it on GitHub. There's a link there. And there's also, I believe, there's some community involvement that people can get in, start contributing to the code, giving feedback. The team is super receptive on feedback. They've put a lot of thought into it, and it's hopefully a lot simpler for people.
Well, thank you so much. That was really interesting about that new kind of way of handling your ARM templates. And obviously, Eric, you gave me a lot to think about when it came to all those things related to the DSLs. And so now we've got a question that's come in from our YouTube chat. And the question is, the human factor that makes it difficult for adoption of infrastructure as code. When you make change, you got to wear a helmet. What strategies do you like to use to engage people? And I'll start with Steve.
Yeah, so this is an area actually I spend a lot of time on when I talk with customers and community members, because we really have to come back and look at what are the the business objectives that we're trying to drive here, and then do our organizational metrics and objectives and the things that we reward people for, do they line up with what we're trying to do with the infrastructure as code? Because it's really, really hard to get people to change the way they're doing things and line them up if they're fighting the organization the whole way. And so, with human factors being kind of one of the hurdles, starting with that organizational alignment and showing why it's clear that adopting these tools and techniques is going to be beneficial, and why you're going to get rewarded for doing so. And that reward could be, hey, you get to keep your job, because maybe the impetus is, if we don't get more efficient in these things, we're not going to be a player in the market anymore, or something like that, right? Whatever that looks like for your organization, if you kind of spell that out, that helps. And then it comes down to getting people comfortable with the tools and the flow of work, because for a lot of admins in shops that I've been experienced in, right, it's a radical change in the flow of work. Now we're authoring documents, we're checking into source control, we're waiting for something to pick up something from source control and then go and do stuff to it. And maybe we have to build automated tests so that we can validate our environments before things roll out further. Versus, I go to the thing, I type some stuff, and changes happen right away, right? So, for me, it comes down to dealing with those human factors. Start with some organizational alignment on why we're making this change.
This is a great question that's a follow-up, and I guess, April, why don't you tackle this one? You find that there are people that are part of the organization, because you're dealing as on commercial software from your side, you're dealing with people who are going to be resistant to change. So you find that there are often people that are part of an organization that are openly hostile to that change, and because we've always done it this way is what people will say. How do you kind of break through to them?
So I think there's two sides of it. So I've been on the side of the fence when you're talking to a customer, and I work a lot in Azure, and primarily in Azure these days. And I've come from the on-premise environment. And we have hybrid cloud a lot. People, you sit in a room of technical people, and you talk about some things, and someone from management's decided we're going to go to the cloud, and they sit there with their arms crossed and goes, well, we've always done this way. Why do we need to change? It works just fine. So people are scared of change. As humans, we want to be comfortable and we want to be happy. We want job security. So I think it's helping to understand people that we're here to enable them to do more. And I always like to show people we're going to be proactive instead of reactive. And that's the approach I tried to take. Now, CSC, we come in and we're aligned to a customer project, and we're there to get them into Azure and unblock them. So they're usually really excited when we're engaged for us to be there, but they're just like, oh, there's so much going on. There's so much to learn. There's this tool called Azure DevOps. There's this infrastructure as code and automation thing, but I always point and clicked and did it before. And then they have to learn Azure. Like, we're throwing a lot at them, but we're showing them that, yes, we're taking time to do it. We're going to break it down. but we're actually helping them learn, and I don't want to say hold their hands, but showing them, running brown bag sessions and coding with them to help make it more comfortable. So sometimes it's being open to learning, and really assisting someone to get to that place and show what the benefits are. So it's a lot of hard work up front. And I think, as we have been in our tech careers, we're kind of like, I'm really comfortable in this little place of life. Actually, let's be proactive. And I don't want to be up at 3 a.m. when there's an outage anymore. I don't want to mistype an IP address and bring down my entire network, because I've done it a lot and I don't want to do that again. And that's usually when you win people, when you're like, how do you like 3 a.m. calls from your C-levels? They're like, yeah, I don't like those. I'm like, yeah, me either. So it's understanding it.
So Eric, that leads me into the next big question, and I'll let the three of you kind of go wild on this, because I think this is a great question. And so Joe wants to know, who should be responsible for ownaging, managing, and maintaining the infrastructure as code elements of our cloud applications? We've talked about how there's change and people are resistant to it, but who should be managing the whole process?
Yeah, well, the answer, as always, is it depends. But that's not a very helpful answer, but it's probably the most correct one. But what does it depend on is the more interesting question. And I would say, it depends a lot on the team size and the team composition. I talk to a lot of teams who have moved from being, as you were talking about, April, that on-prem kind of data center operations folks into being a cloud platform team and a cloud operations team, and they bring that level of operational experience and in the mindset of not wanting to get paged, of being responsible for infrastructure, of not knowing that if something's out there and it's not monitored, that's actually a risk. That's not a shortcut that you really want to take. And so a lot of times the folks on those teams, even though the hands on the keyboard are not working on pixie booting things or kind of the data center stuff, they're working against APIs and they're working on cloud services. It makes sense for them to retain responsibility for the code that's managing the infrastructure, because they're also responsible for the infrastructure itself. And on the other side of it, if there's teams where that move very quickly, where developers are infrastructure savvy, where they almost maybe have more of a blank slate to build the infrastructure alongside of the applications rather than retrofit applications onto new infrastructure, then in those kinds of organizations, it can make a lot of sense for that IAC code to travel along with the application, and in some cases even to be in a mono repo right alongside of it, so that you can stand up an environment and run the app on it all from the same place.
April?
Yeah, I was actually gonna let you go, but I'll go. I agree with you, Eric. I think it does absolutely depend. In a lot of the internal engineering teams at Microsoft, we own the feature stack from development all the way into production. So we maintain the environment, we maintain the code. A lot of what we're delivering in CSE and our customer projects, those, it's no longer an ops person versus the developer team. It's coming together and being a more horizontal team and managing the full stack together. So someone may have a strength in a certain area. We see that a lot with customers, but the whole team helps manage that infrastructure, because you're pushing code, but you've pushed code and you start spiking a CPU over here, or consumption, or something spikes, something breaks in the process. So having that monitoring and that feedback, that's for everyone to monitor and manage. So a lot of the times when we're deploying stuff to customer sites, we don't just have an infrastructure team and a networking team anymore. We're pulling those skills in to kind of have a full stack engineering team. So people are still specialists, but they start to broaden that specialty into other things and understand the full stack, and how, my code affects this, or how I make a change in this network affects my virtual machine or my Kubernetes cluster. So it's really important that people become a little bit more knowledgeable across the stack. So this kind of plays into it a bit, but it just depends. I mean, sometimes you give developers a sandbox, or you give your infrastructure team, very strict rules. But I've seen all sorts of flavors with so many different customers.
Yeah, so I'll step out to the side a little bit here, and I think the answers you both gave are very real world, and kind of it depends. But I'll go to the spirit of the question, which was where should it live? And I think it should live as close to the application or services that it is supporting as possible, right? Occasionally we have parts of shared environments, and so we typically see the infrastructure as code for shared infrastructure living usually, with some with a more centralized team. But as much as possible that supports an individual app or service, that infrastructure as code should live as close to, and as close to could be a separate ops team, but it should. I think it should live with like the app team itself. And once we hit the real world, then April and Eric's caveats I think apply very well. But my personal thought on should is as close to the app team as absolutely possible.
Cool. So I have another question that came to us from the audience, but I think it's a really great one, and it's from someone that I know very, very big in the Azure community. It's a great question from Gregor. He asks, at what scale, size project would you start using infrastructure as code to see those benefits? Eric, why don't you lead us off, then April, and then Steve, or go together. Talk to me.
I mean, to me, it's as soon as, and I'll confess that I'm a diehard in this regard, but I think as soon as you have some kind of infrastructure that you care about, then that's the point at which you should try to codify it, because it will inevitably need to be recreated. You might need another one that, another environment that's similar to the previous one, and you might need to share that outside of your own sandbox. And as soon as you get to the point where, not necessarily in terms of number of resources or number of systems, but the point at which the project that you're working on actually matters to yourself or somebody else, that's the point to start encoding it in ISE.
What do you think, April?
I think right away. And exactly what Eric said. I mean, you can build something in the sandbox and someone goes, I want to see your idea, or I need to make that repeatable somewhere else. And why would you build it twice? Why would you point and click twice? Because it's not going to be the same thing. And I think also if you're also learning infrastructure as code, start from a resource group. When I do my Terraform demos, it's recreating a resource group. Now we're doing this, and now we're going to scale this. And it's so easy to do. So if you get those basics down right away with something really simple, it's just boom, 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 boom. So build a sandbox, start there. Because whatever you're building, you're probably going to have to share with someone, and what better way to do it with infrastructure as code.
Sure. And Steve, your same question.
Yeah. So for greenfield stuff, I mostly agree with April and Eric. So brand new, net new stuff, using infrastructure as code just for those reasons. If I want to be able to spin up a new environment, I want to be able to, to test something out, to try something out. I want to be able to recover from, a catastrophic failure. However, there is a cost, and there's a cost to it in terms of, if this is not a pattern I've used before, if I'm not familiar with the tools, if I'm not familiar with it, right? So there's going to be there's going to be a learning curve and a process adoption that's going to happen. And if I'm early enough on in this project and I'm just trying to see if it's even feasible, I might not go the whole route of, all right, I got to go learn me some Puppet to configure this virtual machine, right? Or I've got to go figure out some ARM templates so I can go spin up my Azure environment. I might try stuff. I might go through the portal because that's easier. I might use my Dev Test Labs environments to spin things up and configure some task sequences in there to configure the machines the way I want to. It's not going to be it might not be as efficient as if I went and got all the infrastructure code stuff set in place, but it might be performant enough. All of our technology decisions, all of these steps, they're always trade-offs, and we're going to pick up technical debt somewhere along this process.
Sure.
And it's determining where what's going to help my process along the best. And I think infrastructure as code is a great tool. Mm-hmm. But it is a tool, and we have to evaluate whether or not it's and there's a risk in adopting it, right? Because it's going to add some level of complexity to what we're doing.
So
Yeah, that's totally fair. Sorry, let me just jump in on that. It totally reminded me of the XKCD automation comic where you expect that things are going to go up for a little bit, and then the automation will take over and amortize the amount of investment that you put into automating it relatively quickly. And frequently what actually happens is that you spend more time working on the automation itself than working on the original project and the thing that you were trying to accomplish. And I think that's totally a great point, that there's a break-even place where the amount of investment that you put into the infrastructure and into automation is worth it. And if not, then you're probably not. It's probably not worth doing.
Yeah, you
Agreed.
can look at this. You can look at this comic just real quick before you. Sorry, April, but like this is the perfect example. They put it in and they codified it, if you will. Like the comic codified what seems like the monotonous task of redoing the thing that you need to do over and over again. And in the end, that's kind of what infrastructure as code is all about. It's reducing how much we have to kind of do things over and over again. So I've got another question. It's from Joe again, I believe. And he asks, if the cloud stack is Azure, which is the best current infrastructure as code tool? Terraform, Farmer, Bicep? I'm going to say that that's not even enough as far as what you would call the current tools, because there's so many. But why don't you each kind of tell me what's your preferred tool right now? I'll start off with Steve.
Yeah, best. Going back to what I just said, right? Best is in the context of what your organization is trying to accomplish and what you need to support. If I'm doing multi-cloud and I can wait a little while for some new features to get support, Terraform might be the best choice. If I'm mostly on Azure and I want to, or I want to make sure I'm taking advantage of all the all the native capabilities of the platform, then Bicep might be the route to go, right? If you like functional stuff, Farmer might be a very interesting choice for you. You also have to look at what the tools or what the other tools that you're using are, and what the capabilities on your team are, right? If nobody knows, if nobody knows, functional programming, maybe Farmer's not the route we look. Maybe we look more at Bicep or Terraform. If maybe Pulumi's an option because we have a bunch of C# devs, and that's what we want to keep that. We want to keep that expertise and start to apply that to our infrastructure as code. So it's best is tough to qualify.
Why don't you pick us up next, April?
I agree with Steve. And I'm going to use an example of this past week. I just came off a customer project, and we went with Terraform. But the resources we were deploying had issues, and there were limitations around Terraform and which version we were using. I mean, that's the other thing. So you say which tool. In the middle of the project, version 0.14 of Terraform came out, resolving some issues that we had in 0.13 that we used in the project. But we were so far along the project, we're 6 months in, we couldn't change. We'd already pulled the trigger on Terraform, and then we're just like, we have issues, we have dependency issues, we have timing issues. It got messy. So, going back off what Steve said, what are you deploying? What resources are you looking to deploy to? Are you trying to use the newest, latest, and greatest resources, things that aren't even generally available in Azure, then Bicep or ARM? But it really just depends. And again, like Pulumi, what's your programming background and everything else? So I think it just, people hate it when you say it depends. You almost need a specific use case. But yeah, we got so far down the line in our customer project that we had to run with it. We had to fix it. We had to, fix the bugs and make things happen. But yeah, you can get halfway through and maybe it's not the right fit when you're that involved and knee deep.
Makes a lot of sense to me. Eric, I'm going to ask you the same question, but I think you may be a little biased, but I'll allow that bias to go.
I actually don't have a particular, no extreme skin in the game here, and I don't disagree with people's side. And I think y'all are definitely the Azure experts here, so I wouldn't want to
Sure.
speak out of turn there.
Well, no problem at all.
We
Well, you know
use
what?
Puppet and CSE as well, for the record. We don't just use we use any tooling that fits the customer best.
I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah. Same thing across the advocacy team, right? We love tools that are built at Microsoft, but we love what gets you working well in Azure, right? If you're successful with your tool stack, that's good for us.
Sure. So I have a question. And we'll start off with April. April, how has Kubernetes changed infrastructure as code?
I think, I think everyone hears the phrase Kubernetes and like, I must have this Kubernetes. And there's this like ideology that it's going to just change their world and everything's going to be scalable and everything's going to be beautiful and it's going to be amazing. The reality is you go to transform an application and it all falls apart. Not every time, and some applications are better than others. But Kubernetes is interesting because it automates a lot of things for you. It's not always the best use case, and I think a lot of people have an idea that it's going to solve all their problems. So I think Kubernetes has been interesting because I've walked into customers that the developers are managing the Kubernetes environments, the clusters. And I've been in other environments where it's the operational teams. And Kubernetes is such a gray area because it spans both teams heavily. And yet, the operational teams potentially, there's a bit of a learning curve going into it. And the devs are like, oh, yeah, I got this. It's all code. We're cool. But then they're like, oh, networking, don't want to touch it. And you're like, well, you have to. So I think Kubernetes has really blurred the lines between the teams, which is great. Because it forces, whether you're developer, operations, QA, whatever, to understand more about the stack of what you're deploying. So it's not just as simple as an ops question anymore, or developer question. It really brings all the teams together to make this, to actually deliver this product and to get your apps, containerized and scalable.
Hit me, Eric. What do you think?
This one I will address directly. So Brian Grant, who's one of the core Kubernetes devs and has been at Google forever and worked on the principles that evolved into Kubernetes, has a great thing on his GitHub called declarative application management in Kubernetes. And it's all about how to describe what your app looks like so that it runs on Kubernetes. And the core principle of having these declarative control loops that the Kubernetes software itself reconciles and brings into alignment is like a great solution to the problem, but it itself generates more problems because then you have to generate and feed in the configuration that tells it what things ought to look like. And it's, in a sense, it's really just moved the goalpost for where you need how you generate and build that configuration a little further downfield, and modernized it certainly for today's infrastructure. But it hasn't made the IC problem go away at all. It's just sort of changed forms. And in that paper, he's got a link to just a kind of crowdsourced spreadsheet of tools that people have written for managing configuration on Kubernetes. And I think there was something like 140 of them at the last I looked. And that's just a ton of tooling that people have built in order to, create and manage what ultimately is these, fairly long-winded YAML files, which is the native API for Kubernetes. And so again, we're back to like, we need higher order tools in order to manage and build configuration for these things. Things are definitely better in a lot of ways. Like, it's great to not have to manage the specific configuration of a load balancer and to get horizontal scalability for your application without having to know the intricacies of it. But it hasn't made the problem go away at all. It's really just, as I said, moved it a little further downfield.
Sure. Steve, any thoughts about how Kubernetes really changed the game for infrastructure as code?
Yeah, not much. I agree with what Eric was saying there in terms of it moved the goalpost. It changed where, what we target, and it made the conversation around infrastructure as code to manage full VMs a little more challenging. If in turn, obviously there's could be large estates of virtual machines to manage for a while, and so so that it doesn't go away, but it makes it harder to sell as a future-looking thing because a lot of people are looking at containers and Kubernetes. But I think the single most impactful thing to me is the highlighting kind of the importance of Git as part of your infrastructure as code management process, because now I have all the YAMLs and I need to contain them inside of inside of some sort of version control so that we can version these things as we go, and because we're pushing some of the configuration more towards the dev teams, there tends to be a greater willingness to adopt that version control. I've seen over the last 10 years a huge shift in the operations community in terms of embracing source control. In fact, I first learned about the idea of using source control from a systems administrator, from Tom Limoncelli's book, the practice.
Love Tom.
The practice system and network administration, right? And so I've always been an advocate of it in the operational space, but it's taken some time to catch on, and this has helped push that a little bit. So things that help push that down the road, I tend to be a fan of.
I love Tom Limoncelli. He's brought a lot to the game in the last few years, and I really have enjoyed having conversations with him about the thing that he kind of put into the forefront of my head, and that was system administration. And so you brought up a really cool subject, and it actually led into our next question. Very perfect transition, Steve. Very, just perfect. And so the question is, is it appropriate for infrastructure as code to be part of the main project repo, or should the templates be managed outside of this? And so, Steve, you get to go again.
Yeah. Cool. Yes. The answer is yes. So, is it appropriate should be a part of the main project repository? Yes. Or should it be managed outside of it? Yes. It really depends. I'm going to call back to some of what Eric and April were saying earlier. It really depends on what your existing team structures look like, where the flow of this thing's managed. I think it should be as close to the application as possible. So main repo, all for it. Some of it depends too on what you're considering your infrastructure as code, right? Is it so let's go back to put my chef hat back on, right? And you have a bunch of cookbooks that are the policies. Are those all in the same repo as your application? Maybe, right? Or is it, do you have separate definitions of these things it's one of those big, it depends, but in my personal viewpoint, as close to the application as possible. And, you come up with a mono repo versus, many small repos as part of a project argument as well. And I don't think we've come to a definitive answer on that.
Very cool. April, I will ask you the same question. Do you think it's appropriate to be keeping it within the same repo, additional repo? What do you think?
I have to agree with Steve. Absolutely, you keep the infrastructure as code close to the application. And when we're deploying with customers, that's what we're doing. It's in the same repository. We have a folder structure kind of outline that we use to say, right, our infrastructure as code goes here. We call it from here in our pipelines. But it's next to our code for the application and the rest of the deployment that's managing that application stack or environment. So we absolutely put it there because they're dependencies on each other. So it's I don't know if it's really a documented best practice, but it's something we do with customers day in and day out. So, you can use different pipelines if you want to, but the code sits in the same repo. You can call it, you can reference it, run your tests against it, and it makes it easier. And I think your tooling changes that as well. So a lot of times we're using Azure DevOps with our customers. So we can call it into our pipelines. It's all in the same repo and just defined in our folder structure. And it makes things super easy and seamless for us when we're deploying our code.
What do you think, Eric? Same question.
I have a little bit of a different take on it because I think one of the important things that have emerged from the ISC community and a huge credit to the Chef community for this, because I feel like they were kind of really planted the stake and were pioneers in this area. But the testing and the tooling around tests for infrastructure code that that Chef had, and that I think has expanded across to the other tools in the space, is I think sui generis. It's like enough of its own thing that it can be worth having a repo that just has your infrastructure code, so that, as we were talking a minute ago about GitOps, so that the CI tests and the spec and integration tests that are specific to that ISC don't get intermingled with the application code, and so that a commit that causes a failure because of a syntax validation failure in a Terraform file, for example, is isolated to just that part of the code base, and application changes can proceed more or less normally, and a change that happens inside of that ISC code won't block or otherwise impact the completely unrelated application changes that might be going on. So might be something to think about.
A bad commit won't bring the whole thing down, including, is that what you're saying? You can go ahead, Steve, after.
Well, hopefully the tests are there to catch those bad commits, but if you have your either GitHub Actions CI or Travis CI or one of those other kinds of tools that's set up to run a suite of tests across every commit that gets checked in that infrastructure code repository, that results in the equivalent of a failed build for that IAC. That's the same as an application build failure, but has nothing to do necessarily with that application code. And so it can be beneficial, again, going back to our conversation about team structure and so forth, to have those build failures in your Terraform repository, for example, not affect the continuous deployment of your application code that rides on top of that infrastructure.
Yeah. So Eric said what's in my head better than I did. So that's when I was that's where I was trying to go when I mentioned cookbooks.
Sure.
Having your cookbooks separate. And so if we can componentize our infrastructure as code well enough that those components are in their own repositories or our own projects, and they have testing wrapped around them, such that we can build a high degree of confidence that when we compose these things, they will provide us the infrastructure that we expect. Then we have that definition that composes the infrastructure in with our application, and maybe we have the components separate, and maybe it's maybe we're referring to it by versions, or we have some way to pin to particular states of that of those components. But then we can evolve our infrastructure, but we keep the definition of what manages the infrastructure for the application alongside the application, so that we have that kind of, this version of the application goes with this version of the infrastructure. But we can also evolve our infrastructure with strong tests in isolation, and and so such that it can support multiple uses.
Great. So let's in that vein, let's hit this question, because we're running toward the end, and I thought that this was a good follow-up. So this is a good example of using like the Git Sparse Checkout concept that could be used to keep stuff together, yet allow people not to focus on things unrelated to their specific work. I'm not too familiar with Git Sparse Checkout. Maybe one of the three of you are. I guess.
I'm glad you said that, because I'm not either.
I'm not either, really.
Oh, hey, sorry about that, legendary Moo. Enjoyed your username. Unfortunately, wasn't able to answer your question. Let me see what I've got left. I think I have a few questions left. But in the meantime, I want to remind everybody, if you go to aka.ms/learntv, you can take our poll. We're heading towards the end of the show, and it's been really, really awesome to get all of your questions answered. And so remember, if you do have a question, just before, we got like 7 minutes left, make sure you pop it into the chat. And yes, Moo, you stumped the panel.
So Sparse Checkout lets you take out a portion of the repo, right? And so it's sort of like it's a way to work with a portion of a monorepo. if I'm recalling correctly. And it can be a technique for letting you work on the infrastructure as code and not care about the other things, and to keep stuff together. But there are a lot of technical processes that we can put into place, that can make our lives horrible as well, right? Like submodules and Git solves some stuff, but it introduces other problems. So
So I had an involuntary nose wrinkle of
Yeah.
face from when you said Git submodules. I just physically could not help it.
I know it seems like it would be this great solution, but the technical implementation leads to a number of challenges. So rather than looking for architecting my pattern around a particular technology, I look for the technology, or look for the pattern. I establish a pattern, then I find technical tools that help me implement that pattern. But yeah,
Cool.
just my 2 cents on that.
No problem. So let's get to the lightning round. Just a few more quick questions. April, in a minute, less than a minute, do you think, and I think this is a really good question, do you think we'll ever see AI-driven tools for infrastructure as code?
Absolutely. I think we absolutely will. We're starting to see a lot with it into the IDEs, with IntelliSense, et cetera. I think we're going to see a lot more come from this area. We're building some of our other products in Microsoft. I think that field is really young, but it's going to grow heavily in the next few years.
What do you think, Eric?
I'm not sure about building it, but definitely any kind of problem space where we're looking at large data sets these days is a great, a field that probably some kind of ML or AI is going to be applied to. And running giant infrastructures is definitely one of those. So for me, I would imagine the emerging technologies to be more around detection, self-healing, and changes to the infrastructure without humans necessarily being involved, rather than the tooling that actually creates the template itself.
Steve, quick, what do you think? AI is coming to infrastructure as code? Yes or no?
I think it's already there.
Oh, yeah? How so?
So it depends on how wide you go with your definition of infrastructure as code. But I mean, you can even look at things like AZ find in the AZ CLI, and it can suggest common things based on the patterns it sees people using the ARM APIs to do, right? So you try to do something with the Azure CLI, and AZ find can suggest, oh, you know what? A bunch of calls that do this, they're all similar. So here, we're going to recommend you use these things, right? Or you do these things. So,
Great.
And I think VS Code has the AI, which is the IntelliSense in VS Code and Visual Studio is all AI backed. And it does pull from a library of most common used and best practice coding standards in theory.
Yeah.
So,
Well, hey, everybody, we're down to our last 2 minutes or so. And I just wanted to be able to kind of give everybody a second to let people know where they can find you on the internet, what you're working on, anything specific. Eric, you're our guest. What's going on?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I'm working on the service whose awesome t-shirt I'm wearing. It's relay.sh. Please check it out. Particularly, we have some great integrations with Azure. So if you're working on Azure and you want to stitch together things like your resources with a notification for Teams or Slack, or a PagerDuty alert that comes in and you need to trigger off some resource creation or changes, Relay might be a good solution for that. And just drop by and check it out. Happy to chat with you.
Awesome. April, anything interesting you want to let us know about? Any projects you're working on?
So I actually can't talk about a lot of my customer projects because they're all under NDA, but I will have some publications coming out soon with some of the technical learnings from the project in the next few weeks, some white papers, and hopefully in the next 30 to 60 days, there'll be some stuff coming out on LinkedIn and Twitter on some of the learnings we had from the project that would be around IAC, some serverless and securing serverless standards in Azure.
Steve, what about you? What do you got going on? I know you've got a session coming up pretty soon.
Yep. Next week I'll be back on Learn TV here, doing a Learn Live where we will go through a Microsoft Learn module with our student ambassadors. So I will be joined by Fatini Savidou, one of our student ambassadors from Greece, and she and I will go through a Learn module on automation, and we'll talk about scripting and infrastructure as code and Terraform and all sorts of fun stuff. So
cool. I'm going to be doing that same thing on Friday. We're going to be doing one on elasticity in the cloud. Please show up. Check my Twitter at jdestro. You will find out all that information. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much. You are beautiful people. I appreciate you taking part in all this. And I want to end the show the way I love to end all my shows. Let's give everybody a great goodbye wave and thank them all for being part. We really appreciated you. Thanks for all your questions. We'll see you next time. We'll be back in a month. We'll have another panel. We'll be talking about agile development. We'll see you then.